So a little history about that picture. I really choose a lot of the pictures. And this was in front of my house on the other side of the street. And it's a washing machine. And I said, and that's where I got the title, the idea for the title for this talk. Because it's a washing machine that was all deconstructed into its parts. And I thought it was very interesting. And of course the red, but that's where I got the idea of deconstructing monetary policy.
I think that's something my question.
Sorry?
It's to help.
Yeah. This way?
Perfect.
Alright.
So let me give you a little summary. We started by, saying mainstream theories in disarray, but we knew that. But it really is, contrary to what they might claim, they're just all over the map. And this one touches on that today. We're going to show how the monetary policy and theory is just in disarray. And everything in economics is an empirical question. If you say, investment grows when, that's an empirical question. And it's up to people who are savvy in empirics to go and prove that. And you get some good data, you measure that. And we'll touch upon that today. But, so we're kind of returning to that topic of being in disarray, but with a lot more precision in the answer. Then, we said, oh, mainstream is in disarray. That opens the door to an alternative. Then we started talking about an alternative, the Post-Keynesian alternative, and how it stands in contrast with the mainstream. And how one of the main ingredients is this idea of realisticness, or looking at the reality. As Keynes tells us, that guy that I never quote, the real world. I told her, I'm not going to quote Keynes today.
I'm counting.
So we need to look at the real world. And we're going to do that a little bit today, because we're going to look into, without looking into numbers, but we're basing this on quotes, on the empirical, or the ideas. How are they supported in the real world? Are they relevant? So we're definitely going to look at that today. By looking more specifically at monetary policy, theory and policy. And we're going to look at the dominant model. And I'm going to deconstruct it, all the elements of that model. And I'm going to say why every part of that model is wrong. Wrong. Based on some empirical work done by others. And at the end of today, I'm going to say mainstream monetary policy is ridiculous. Really. And then break, and then we're going to come back and say, okay. Because there's two things you need to do. You need to break down the current theory, and you need to rebuild with an alternative. So that's what we're doing. Okay. I just wanted to again dedicate this talk to Alain Barguez, my old and dear friend and mentor. I'll tell you a story. When I was defending my PhD, I was quite the, oh, look at me, oh, look at my PhD. And so I defended it the week after the Eastern Economic Association in New York, and I was at the New School. So I told everyone, oh, come to my PhD defense. It'll be fantastic because it's me, that kind of attitude. And a lot of people came. And my dissertation committee was Edward Mill, Marc Lavoie, and Alain Barguez. And I gave my talk, and it's you get very nervous. Has anyone gone through their PhD defense here? Not yet. So don't invite me. So some people, very true, some people would invite their grandmothers, thinking that people wouldn't dare reject your PhD in front of your grandmother. But I invited friends. And there was this guy there called Bernard Valajas. And Bernard, I never understood him in the best of time. Never understood. Plus his accent is very strong. Plus I'm nervous. And at the end of my dissertation, Bernard asks a question. And I don't understand. I'm going to fail. I'm not getting my PhD. And I seeing the horror and panic on my face, intervenes, yes. What Bernard is saying is that blah, blah, blah. And I'm listening to him and I go, yeah, I was just going to say that, exactly. So I like to say that he saved my PhD. And I always had this wonderful expression, vive la révolution. He would always say that. He would end many of his articles, his presentations, with vive la révolution. His mother was the president of the French Marxist Association, and his father was a minister of justice in the De Gaulle government. So very conservative and very Marxist. And they only had one child, and that's probably the reason. So this is part of the book that I'm writing called Monetary Policy. There's only 2 chapters. It's a short book, 65,000 words. The first part is written, this is what I'm presenting today, Deconstructing. I'm in the process of writing this, Reconstructing Monetary Policy. It's aimed at undergraduates. And if you have any comments, I'd be very interested to hear them. And the book is called Monetary Policy. That's it. It will be published with Edward Elgar, hopefully next year. So, this is the time of the revival of central banks, the revival of monetary policy. And, the model that they use is the new consensus model. And this is what we're going to look at today. Has anyone heard about the new consensus model? A short, very compact 3-equation model. And that we're going to look at. We're going to look at a very simple, you can have very complicated equations. We're going to look at simple equations, but it gives the essence of what that model is. And that model, 2022, Marx still says that in his book, it is still the bread and butter of central bank researchers. And there was a time, maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, when a lot of post-Keynesians were saying the new consensus model is dead. There was no inflation. So there was, but I've always said, no, it's not dead. It's not dead. It's not dead. And sure enough, as inflation comes back, the gut reaction of that model, the core of that model comes right back to life. And we're going to look at what that model is in just a second. And there's a lot of papers criticizing the new consensus model. Philip Orestes, Malcolm Sawyer, Marc Lavoie, but there are also the very general critiques. This is the first, my book is the first attempt at a step-by-step criticism of every element of that model. So just to look at a little bit of history, before the main model was this monetarism model where the central banks tried to control the money supply in order to control inflation. This is what we did yesterday. But there were oil shocks in 73 and 79. This corresponded with the demise of Keynesianism. It was the end of the bastard Keynesian era. There was a number of things that happened in those years. It was argued that the Keynesian model could not explain inflation. It was your Phillips curve, and then you traveled along your Phillips curve. You either had high inflation, low unemployment, or low unemployment and high inflation. And all of a sudden, you had high unemployment and high inflation. So people were trying to argue in terms of shifting Phillips curve, and Friedman comes along saying, no, at the narrow, you've got your vertical Phillips curve. This is what's happening. And so it was sort of a very conservative counter-revolution, and at the same time, you had a political revolution through the elections of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States. So you sort of had a political revolution and a theoretical revolution through Friedman, and they were sort of coming together. And so with that, there was a re-questioning of monetary policy, and I think that the general consensus of the 1980s under Paul Volcker was that we were unable to control the money supply. So through the 1980s, Volcker was appointed as governor and tried to control the money supply. It was a fiasco. So there was a search for a new model. If not pure monetarism, what's this other model? And it was careful not to give up the main elements of the essential model, being inflation was a monetary phenomenon. And there was years of search. There was debate over rules versus discretion debates. So should we fix the growth of the money supply, or should we use some sort of counter-cyclical discretion? Could the central bank just raise and lower interest rates, or should it fix the money supply? They tried the money supply, didn't work. So the other sort of alternative at this point was to use a theory based on discretion. So the central bank raising, controlling interest rates, leaning against the wind. And so during the 1980s, there was sort of this lost decade. And just as a sidebar, Milton Friedman did not trust central bankers. He was against the idea of central bank independence. And the reason is he did not believe central bankers would do the right thing. And so he did not approve of wide discretion to independent experts. And that's why he proposed his monetary rule. Set the money supply growth at 2%. There you go. Doesn't matter who's in charge of the central bank, whether you're independent or not. If you agree to a rule-based monetary policy approach, then you set the growth of the money supply to 2% or 3%. And you have zero inflation in the long run. But that was a complete fiasco. It was the abandonment of monetary aggregate targeting. For mainly because central banks lost control of the money supply. Why? Well, because money is endogenous. There you go. And there's quite a few good expressions here. Gerald Bowie was governor of the Bank of Canada. He says, "We did not abandon monetary aggregates, they abandoned us." Greenspan from the Fed, a decision to base policy on measures of money presupposes that we can locate money. And that has become an increasingly dubious proposition. And recently, Jerome Powell from the Fed, the classic relationship between monetary aggregates and economic growth and the size of the economy, it just no longer holds. So something we have to unlearn, I guess. And so because monetary supply abandoned central banks, I remember when I was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, my first gig at a college, university there, and I was a chair, and part of my responsibilities was to organize an annual talk. It was called the Monroe. Before I got there, it was fried chicken and French fries. And it was $25. When I got there, I charged $500 a ticket, and it was called the best meal of the year. I had a chef, hired a chef to prepare this amazing meal. My motto is, if you can't be over the top, don't do it. Everything I do must be over the top. But I invited the governor of the central bank, of the Federal Reserve, white, and he came to give a talk, and the talk was for bankers and lawyers, and he spoke about monetary policy for an hour. Over the hour, I remember Mary Harper. She was an accountant, very well-respected accountant. She raised her hand, and this was 1999. She goes, "You just spoke to us for an hour and a half, Mr. Federal Chairman of the Chicago Fed, and you never once mentioned money supply." And his reply, and I remember, said, "We don't care about this." And this is the Federal Reserve Governor of Chicago, known as being a very conservative. So yeah, they don't care about it. And I remember when I was a kid, when I was 20, and you would go to the central bank, and data on money supply were on the first page. You found it everywhere. Today, you have to go through many websites to get data on money supply, M1, M2, whatever you want. Difficult to find. It's not difficult, but you have to know where to find it. That's my point. Whereas data on interest rates are on the first page. So, yeah. It's no surprise that the monetary aggregates abandoned central bankers because money's endogenous. And that's what happened. And so the search was on to find a new model, and it started in 1990 in New Zealand, Canada, and this was called inflation targeting. This is the new consensus model of inflation targeting. So, whereas the idea before was you control the money supply and hopefully you control inflation. Here it's, no, let's target inflation, pure and simple. So it was thought to be a better model because you announce that you're targeting a specific level of inflation, 2%. Here it's 4% in Brazil, 5%?
It's now 3.5 this year.
So, and inflation is?
Now it's 5.
No, it's 3%.
The last
Yes, the last 12 months, 3.2%.
Yeah.
So that's why they lowered interest rate.
Yeah, they should have done that before that.
Yeah.
Yes.
But England just raised interest rates yesterday. So, or this morning, I can't. So this was the new model. This is the new consensus model of inflation targeting. And this is what we're going to look at. Now, why bother about inflation? Why are we so obsessed with inflation? There was a great newspaper article in the New York Times in 1974 written by James Tobin. And Tobin talks about inflation hysteria. I'm going to go back to that tomorrow when I talk about inflation. But it's very true. Why are we obsessed with inflation? And why are we obsessed with low inflation? Well, inflation is seen as a societal evil. Inflation is evil. Now, from a political economy perspective, inflation in many ways is a good thing. If you are in debt, it reduces the net value of your debt, but it also reduces the net value of your wealth. And I think that the reason central bankers are preoccupied with inflation, it's because it hurts the rentier class or the wealth holders class. And there's pressure from, when the central banks were not raising interest rates, when inflation was starting to increase a year ago, the financial markets were telling central banks, you are incompetent, you are, you're not doing your job. And then central banks started raising interest rates. The wealth holders wanted to protect their wealth. I think this is why it's seen as an evil. And not the central banks. You go on any central bank, they won't tell you this. What they tell you is, because high inflation makes consumption more expensive, and poor people can't, struggling people can't make ends meet. That's how they justify lowering inflation. Well, in many ways, that's probably very true. When I go to the grocery stores, I see it, and I hear people go, can't afford apples. Broccoli was 40 Irish. Yeah. So, people, and you hear people, and I love groceries. Because I miss, whenever I travel, the first thing I do is I go to the groceries. Try to look at the prices. To see, how the cost of food is. And you hear people. And that's undoubtedly true. But I think the real motivation is to protect the wealth of the wealth. And so there's an emphasis on low inflation as a public good. Low inflation is a public good, they argue. There's a fantastic book by Clément Fontan, who's a sociologist. Do central banks serve the people? It is a fantastic book. I really recommend you read it. And if you're too lazy to read a big book, Mario Secareccia in the Journal of Economic Issues wrote a paper called Whose Interests Do They Protect? Whose interests do they serve? And this, as we'll see after, is literally a view of central banking, a view of monetary policy based on social classes. Whose interests are central banks protecting, serving? Gerald Epstein, central banks do policy through finance-colored lenses, he tells us. Glasses that are colored with the interest, vested interest. And that is what Polanyi was arguing. Who has ever heard of Polanyi? And this is, very much a Polanyian sort of approach to seeing how monetary policy is exercised. Okay. And what we'll see in the new consensus model, it's a simple model of three equations. And in a way, I think that's one of the reasons why it was so popular among central banks, because it's an easy model. Whereas, post-Keynesians, we say things like, this is a great quote by Phillips and Malcolm Sawyer, it is a long and uncertain chain of events from an adjustment in the interest rate controlled by the central bank, exogenous interest rate, controlled by the central bank, to a desired change in the rate of inflation. It's a long, complicated story. I was telling the story at lunchtime, where, sometimes I get, I'm better at it because I've trained, I've been trained. But, reporters 10 years ago would call me and say, what do you think of monetary policy? And I go, well, on the one hand, and it's complicated. That's not what it means. But that's kind of reflective of how we think. Now when they call me, what do you think of monetary? Oh, it's awful. Oh yeah, whatever. But yeah, it is a complicated story. you bring down, why did investment not increase when interest rates went down to zero? Classical theory says there's an inverse relationship. Bring interest rates to zero and investment should be booming. It did. Why? Complicated. Investment dependent on the expected growth of So it's a long and uncertain chain of events. Keynes tells us there are several slips, the one that I won't quote, several slips between the cup and the lip. And I'm sorry, I think I'm coming across as being the biggest hypocrite in the world when I say, don't quote Keynes. Okay. So at the end of this talk, there's nothing left of mainstream theory. There's nothing left. In fact, we're going to reach a conclusion that monetary policy is impotent. I wrote a paper, it's in your syllabus, called The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy. In fighting inflation, monetary policy does have implications, and we'll look at that after. Yeah, if you raise interest rates to 13, 14%, of course you're going to have consequences on your economy. But the goal of monetary policy, according to the mainstream, is to fight inflation. And we'll discuss that tomorrow, but I'm going, no, it's impotent. It doesn't do that. It does something else, but it doesn't, I used to say that monetary policy is like a big, big sledgehammer. And your inflation is a little fly on your table. And you want to kill your fly, you use a sledgehammer and you go, and you kill your fly, but you also kill the table. Okay? So it's a blunt instrument. And if you have different parts of your country that are based on industrial, non-industrial, farming, it may have different effects, different parts of. And that's why I'm a big fan of fiscal policy. You can tailor fiscal policy. What's the best policy for the north of Brazil? And it could be different from, the south of Brazil. And you can tailor fiscal policy much better than you can monetary policy. So, new consensus, or the neo-Vixelian, or the new Keynesian, which is the more mainstream expression, models. Romer, 2000, I told you about that model, that paper. Monetary policy without the LM curve. You find it in Woodford. And it is the new international monetary system according to Edward Ross. It's certainly built on long-run neutrality of money. Everything is neutral in the long run, right? And this is going to be a major important difference with post-Keynesians. But doesn't have short-run endogenous money? I don't know. Some version of it, maybe, yeah. Again, some version of it. But inflation is still seen as related to money or aggregate demand or monetary policy. Money is everywhere a monetary policy phenomenon, to paraphrase Friedman, which explains monetary policy dominance. Or according to Gordon, in the long run, inflation is always and everywhere an excess nominal GDP phenomenon. That hasn't changed. And this is why Marc Lavoie calls this model new wine in an old bottle. In that paper with Brett Feiberger that I put on your reading list, they go through why the new consensus model is still a monetarist model. Because the main arguments of monetarism, inflation, neutrality of money, it's still in that model. okay? It's based on central bank independence. You know, central bank, if you want to talk about hypocrites, here you have all these people, you know, talking about central bank independence, governors of central bank, European central bank saying, oh, we're independent. Yet Mario Draghi during the financial crisis said, no, the central bank will do anything in its power to protect the euro. That's not central bank. That was a very political. So they might be independent in theory, and they might say that to protect themselves, but in practice, I'm not sure the degree to which they are independent, or certainly ready to bend the rules. It's based on this concept of the natural rate of interest, as we'll see. And it's also based, and I don't really talk about it, but I'll just say something about it here. We know about how important it is in the mainstream literature, this inflation expectations. We hear all about that. And another expression they use is anchoring expectations. Oh, we need to control, we need to bring inflation back down because we don't want agents to have expectations of high inflation because they're going to demand higher wages, etc. There's a few papers now criticizing that, but there was a paper in 2022 in the review of Keynesian Economics.
Amazing paper.
Amazing paper, and Rudd is with the Federal Reserve.
I think he published before.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a
Working
paper
Yeah.
at the Federal Reserve.
Yeah,
That is amazing.
yeah. And Paul says, Paul Rudd is the actor. Rudd, I can't remember his name. And he says, economists and economic policymakers believe that households and firms' expectations of future inflation are a key determinant of actual inflation. A review of the relevant theoretical and empirical, that's important.
Yeah.
The empirical part suggests that this belief rests on extremely shaky foundations. And a case is made that adhering to it uncritically could easily lead to serious policy errors. But the mainstream is never going to give it. This is one guy and one Federal Reserve. There. But it's interesting, and there has been a couple of other papers now come out. One of the ECB recently, echoing the same idea that inflation expectations or inflationary expectations play no role in actual inflation. Okay. So the new consensus model, another expression, mainstream expression, is the modern view of monetary policy. This is not Lance Taylor. At the practical level, the Taylor rule, this is that Taylor. At the practical level, a common view of macroeconomics is now pervasive, right? Consensus. In policy research projects at universities and central banks around the world. It differs from past views, it doesn't. But it explains the growth and fluctuations of the modern economy. It can thus be said to represent a modern view of economics. And it's simple and it's an elegant model, 3 equations. An IS curve. You know what an IS curve is? IS curve? It's the relationship between interest rates and consumption and investment. Interest rates and aggregate demand, and it's a negative relationship. High interest rates should bring consumption and investment down. And that, I'll get to that. Okay, the second one is your Phillips curve, which is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So if you increase your interest rates, investment and aggregate demand come down. If aggregate demand comes down, unemployment goes up, and because of the Phillips curve, inflation should come down. simple, elegant. And the third equation is a reaction function by the central bank, and that's your Taylor rule. And we'll get to that in just a second. It's your Taylor rule. The Taylor rule is a central bank controls interest rates and raises or lowers interest rate relative to an inflation target. So if current inflation is above 2%, you raise interest rates, that should bring output down, raise unemployment, bring down inflation. And inflation comes down, and the idea is that you drift down to your inflation target in a soft landing. Right? Soft landing is you just kind of drift down and you don't create a recession. Yeah. You lower output, you raise a little bit of unemployment. And you have to have a very sort of quasi-vertical or very inelastic you have to have a very elastic IS curve. You raise your interest rate a little, then it has that impact on output. And then you have to have sort of a, elastic Phillips curve. Because then unemployment comes down just a little bit, well, not necessarily elastic, but enough that you can have an impact on inflation and then problem solved. In theory, it does not matter whether you have an interest rate. Yeah, it doesn't matter. In this, the logic still applies. With the monetarist idea of controlling the money supply. The rules are responsive, calling for changes in the money supply, the monetary base, or the short-term interest rate. So Taylor's telling you that it's really compatible with that model, And I remember when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote to Benjamin Friedman. Benjamin Friedman is this very well-known Keynesian, not post-Keynesian, Keynesian economist at heart. And I wrote to him and I said, your model has endogenous money. I was explaining to him. He goes, it doesn't matter whether you have endogenous money or not. For the mainstream, interest rate, in the mainstream, I think they still believe that they could control the money supply if they wanted to. But right now, they prefer controlling interest rates. And that's what sort of Friedman was telling me. Friedman, right? Ben, not related to Milton. But he was saying, no, it doesn't matter which one. And here, Taylor says the same thing. No, calling for changes in the money supply or the monetary base or short-term interest rates in response to changes in the price level. And then you stop when inflation comes back to your inflation target, which is, in other words, a natural rate of inflation. So you have a model with a natural rate of unemployment, natural rate of growth, natural rate of interest, and the natural rate of inflation. And your natural rate of interest, when you reach when your market rate is equal to your natural rate of interest in a very Vixelian world, then inflation is equal to your natural rate of inflation or your target inflation. Same old story. Same old story. And Levois, old wine in a new bottle. Okay, so this is the model again in terms of, and even sort of these tank or rank models, these Hank model is homogeneous agent new Keynesian model. It's a dynamic stochastic model, general equilibrium. Rank is your rational agent, new Keynesian, and tank is your, what's tank? T is, anyways, some sort of version. And I looked at that literature, and they sort of all lead to the same conclusion. Okay, first equation. Well, there you go. I put this in terms of output gap. Here's your natural rate of output. And when your market rate is above, it leads to, if you have to raise your market rate above your natural rate, and that will bring down your gap. If your gap brings down, your inflation comes down. And this is the Taylor rule. Okay, so as you put your natural rate of interest on the other side, you have your monetary policy. And when your inflation gap is equal, 0, and your output gap is 0, well, this to be 0, you have to have your market rate in equilibrium with your natural rate. But this is your inflation target, or your natural rate of inflation. Natural rate of inflation, natural rate of output, natural rate of interest, and your, so these are all natural rates. These are all centered.
Unemployment.
Sorry?
Natural rate of unemployment.
Yeah, embedded in here. And these are all centers of gravitation. And in fact, the reason I go, do they have interest, endogenous money? Well, the sole purpose of monetary policy is to bring your market rate equal to your natural rate. That's what you want. So this natural rate acts as a center of gravitation towards which eventually inflation will, and the reason, and you can't observe this, but they say, there's inflation. If you have inflation, then of course your market rate must be too low. So you got to raise it. Okay, that's how they, okay. I'm going to do 8 things. I'm going to look at inflation targeting. I'm going to look at the IS curve relationship. I'm going to look at the Phillips curve. I'm going to look at the natural rate of interest. I'm going to look at fine tuning. I'm going to look at the demand side inflation. I'm going to look at central bank independence. And I'm going to look at the concept of monetary policy dominance, which, we've talked about. Some of these things we've talked about. Okay. Let's look at inflation targeting. In most countries, the inflation target is 2%, or a corridor of between 1 and 3, for example. And that is set to guarantee maximum employment. Acts as a center of gravitation. But why 2%? And I've told you I've looked at many papers of the Central Bank of New Zealand, can't find anything. Interestingly enough, Ben Friedman, again, great economist. This is an Effeschrift in honor of Vitor Constancio, who was VP of the ECB. And Ben says, there is this arbitrariness. Arbitrary, right? Arbitrary means whatever. Right? There is this whatever surrounding the current 2% target. In retrospect, the paucity, the lack of serious empirical research underlying the identification of the 2% norm, now quite some back in 1990, is a professional embarrassment. Wow. I could not have written something so cruel. He's right. There was no empirical evidence to support the idea of a 2% target. Why 2%? Because in Canada, I can tell you, if the target was 4, inflation in Canada is 2.7 now. If the inflation had been 3 or 4%, we wouldn't have had, inflation came down and was at 4% 6 months ago, which means the Bank of Canada should have started lowering rates 6 months ago. Because it's 2%, while we are in that corridor of between 1 and 3, we're still away from that 2%. I bet you when the data for inflation comes out next month, we're going to be at 2.5 or 2.4. But if the target, so the choice of your target is very important. Emmanuel Carré, a very good economist in France, economic theories have played a limited role in the creation of inflation targeting. Yeah, absolutely. I've looked at the Bank of Canada, and now once it was just chosen by New Zealand central banks just went. And I told you, I saw a video where the president of the central bank of New Zealand just said, whatever, 2%, whatever, that's it. But it's a professional embarrassment, the fact that we chose such an important part of policy without any empirical validation whatsoever. And there's also the question of whether inflation targeting has been successful. And there's a lot of empirical evidence showing that, no. If you look at inflation, even today, when you look at inflation rates around the world, they've all started kind of coming down at the same time. The only reason you can make that happen in the new consensus model is to argue that every country in the world have had a decrease in aggregate demand. A similar decrease in aggregate demand. Well, Post-Keynesian can argue that very nicely by saying, oh, price of oil, the bottlenecks have disappeared, etc. That's why you have a decrease in inflation in many countries. In Spain, it's like down to 2%. Brazil, you said 2.3.2. 3.2, it's nothing. And so, is it because of inflation targeting? If you look at inflation in 1985 or so, and this was after the oil shocks, as the price of oil started coming down in the 82, 83, then you started seeing inflation all around the world. You saw inflation coming down. And inflation targeting was adopted in 1990. Inflation was already on the way down in many countries. So, I don't think personally inflation targeting explains the decrease in inflation in the mid to late 1980s. Now, I've had this argument, and what some mainstream economists were telling me is that central banks were acting like inflation targeters before they were inflation targeters. But then the other thing we got to look at is, okay, maybe inflation targeting is not responsible for having brought down inflation from their peaks to trough in the mid to late 80s. But why has inflation been more or less 2% for the past 40 years? Canada, US, Europe, inflation has just hovered around that 2% target. Has inflation targeting worked from when it was adopted until recently? That's a question that I will look at. But for me and Mario Seccareccia, we've argued that what the central banks have done is they've basically told workers, if you demand more than 2%, we're going to raise interest rates. So interest rate policy becomes sort of that carrot. Don't raise it. It was a way of sort of keeping labor docile. And we've seen with post-COVID, the governor of the Bank of England say, you better not raise your wage demands because we're going to raise interest rates even further. So you've had these sort of threats to labor. Again, it's a social conflict view of monetary policy. Okay. The concept of a 2% target, the concept of inflation targeting has no empirical support. Okay, one thing that's wrong with the model. The second part is the IS curve. Here's your MP curve, your horizontal LM or monetary policy curve, to use Romer's expression, and then you have your IS curve. And this IS curve has to be you've got to have those degrees of freedom, such that when you raise interest rates, you have to have a significant or statistically significant decrease in output. Now, in reality, the IS curve is very inelastic. And what you have is you have central banks raising interest rates and they go, output hasn't decreased. Why? Well, because the IS curve is inelastic. But they go, well, let's raise interest rates again. And they wait. And they've raised interest rates 11 times in the United States. Still no decrease in output. And my view is that output does not react to incremental changes in interest rates, but it will react to the cumulative impact. Maybe it's that 12 times, right before the financial crisis, interest rates in the United States were raised 13 times. And that 13th time is what broke the camel's back. If investment depends on expectations of the growth of aggregate demand, or a proxy for that is expectations of the rate of profit on your investment. And if your rate of profit that you expect is 10%, your return on your investment, raising rates to 1.5, 175, 2, 225, 250, 275, 3 may not affect your investment decisions. But you raise your interest rate to 5.5, 5.75. At that point, firms are going to say, now it's not worth it. And you see that in the data in the United States and Canada, interest rates going up and investment, boom. Okay, that's your sledgehammer. Okay, and we don't know because we live in an uncertain world with animal spirits. That pains. We don't know what that interest rate threshold is. Is it a 12th increase, 13th, 11 times so far? Is it a 12th, 13th, a 14th? We don't know. Okay. But let's look. Mainstream theory expects the IS curve to be elastic. For the monetary transmission mechanism to work, you need changes in interest rates to have a predictable, sizable impact on output in the first instance. Robert Hall, the more sensitive the response, the more potent is monetary policy. Yeah, of course. And this is all the literature on the effectiveness of monetary policy from a mainstream perspective depends on that IS curve to be elastic. Indeed, the stimulus of lower interest rates on investment is one of the principal channels of monetary influence in virtually all macroeconomic theories, including some versions of Post-Keynesian economics. And this is a critique also of Post-Keynesian economics. I was in Rio, and there was a paper that said, you lower interest rates, and I go, well, no. You have to lower interest rates, even if you lower interest rates to 0. You may not have that response. But it's in a lot of these models, you have that. Okay. So then, and that's why I'm going, use fiscal policy. Okay. And it's an empirical question. And here are some great quotes. Barry Cinnamon, Stephen Fazzari, and Mark Setterfield. The transmission mechanism for monetary policy to aggregate spending in new consensus models relies on the interest sensitivity of consumption. It is difficult, however, to find empirical evidence that households do indeed raise or lower consumption by a significant amount when interest rates change. Some authors have generalized the link to include business investment, the famous Fazzari paper with Ferry and Greenberg in 2010, but a robust interest elasticity of investment has also been difficult to demonstrate empirically. And this, okay, forget Cinnamon and Fazzari and Setterfield. These are like heterodox post-Keynesians. Who need them? Let's quote the Federal Reserve. In a famous paper by Suarez and Sharpie, which they reconfirmed in 2021, by the way, a large body, not just a few papers, a large number of papers of empirical, not theoretical, empirical, many empirical papers offer mixed evidence. At best, it's mixed. for substantial interest rate effects on investment, our research finds that most firms claim the investment plans to be quite insensitive to decreases in interest rates and only somewhat more responsive to interest rate increases, right? That 12th, that 13th time, that 14th time that they raise interest rates. Eventually it will just collapse. Okay, we're not done with these quotes. Krugman. It's a dirty little secret of monetary analysis that changes in interest rates affect the economy. So he's saying it's mainly through real estate and the housing market. But he says any direct effect on business investment is so small that it's hard even to see it in the data. What drives such investment is expectation, perceptions about market demand. And then, if you don't want to believe Krugman, a Nobel laureate, it means nothing, but Krugman, or the Federal Reserve, how about the IMF? They reached the same conclusion. According to the authors, there appears to be little unexplained component of business investment beyond the expected demand effect. Other factors such as reductions in the cost of capital thus appears to have played a relatively minor. Right? So in other words, expected demand is what really drives investment. Apart from that, there's very little unexplained part of that. And again, Robert Hall, the evidence is disappointingly weak about that IS curve. There's more in the IS curve. Oh, I'm just gonna. So even in these Hank models, for example, the direct effects of interest rate shocks in our Hank models are always small, while the indirect effects can be substantial. Households are highly sensitive to labor income shocks, but are not responsive to interest rate changes. So I'm just saying that even in these complicated, these are sort of uncomplicated, simple equations. But even in these new consensus models, they reach complicated equations, they reach the same conclusion. Phillips curve. I couldn't do a curve, so I did a straight line. But it's this negative relationship between inflation and labor. And so that led to discussions about policy choices. You have to choose whether you want to grow unemployment, high inflation, or low inflation, high unemployment. And this is pretty much what the central bank is saying. And Lawrence Summers, when he was on his chair in the Caribbean with the palms behind him, he says we need more unemployment. So he's saying we got to go down this Phillips curve. Okay. Well, there's so many. In Roca, I published a whole special issue devoted to Milton Friedman. His presidential address from 50 years ago, and a lot of papers, and I think I quote some, argue there's no Phillips curve anymore. There's no Phillips curve. And, now they're trying to revive it. Now they're going, but the Phillips curve only works if you have demand inflation. Right? If you increase your unemployment, you decrease demand, and therefore you decrease inflation. This is a demand inflation driven model. If we can prove that inflation is not demand driven, then and a lot of post-Keynesians adopt this type of model instead. Now, instead of unemployment, this is in terms of rates of capacity utilization. And so you have this very sort of long, flat component to your Phillips curve, where, a given level of inflation like I said, inflation for the last 40 years has hovered more or less around 2%. And that has corresponded to fluctuations in output. You no longer have that unique, stable relationship. A given inflation rate can be associated with booms or busts. And if this is a true representation of the Phillips curve, this is what you have. The central banks, inflation is here. And to lower inflation, they increase interest rates. Well, nothing happens to capacity utilization. And they wait. Oh, nothing. And just last week, when the Bank of Canada announced an increase in interest rates, they said, well, we're not sure if interest rates are not high enough or whether they are high enough, they just haven't kicked in yet. And so they're waiting nothing. Let's raise interest rate. Nothing happens. Let's raise interest rate. Nothing happens. Let's raise interest. And so to have an impact on inflation, they have to exploit this flat curve and decrease capacity utilization, increase unemployment to the level where they're on this part of the diagram. Sort of the reality behind monetary policy today. Okay. Well, what are people saying about the Phillips? I love seeing the next slide because I can just link my thoughts to, what do they say? Bullard, who used to be at the Federal Reserve. U.S. monetary policy makers and financial market participants have long relied on the Phillips curve, the correlation between labor market outcomes and inflation to guide monetary policy. Yeah, he says the Phillips curve is what matters. If you don't have a Phillips curve, you don't have monetary policy. NBER, the relationship between inflation and the unemployment rate, is a key input to the design of monetary policy. Okay. But Claudio Borio, chief economist of the Bank for International Settlement, the response of inflation to a measure of labor market slack has tended to decline and become statistically indistinguishable from zero. There's zero relationship between inflation and unemployment. Okay? There's zero relationship. Inflation can be now associated with any level of unemployment. Indistinguishable from zero, in other words, inflation no longer appears to be sufficiently responsive to tightness in the labor market. And with that, now we understand the quote by Rudd. Inflation expectations don't play a role. Borio again, I think it might be, the same paper. The response, I must have liked it so much that I repeated it. Arestis and Sawyer, again, this is what they meant. Robert Gordon, was there ever a Phillips curve? He's always been a lot more critical. He believes in some sort of hysteresis model of labor markets. The BIS, independently of Borio, various inflation drivers have been shaping the inflation process in ways that are at times been difficult to fully understand. The heightened uncertainty has naturally carried over to inflation for and against it. Bob Soto. So this 2018 is that issue of the Review of Keynesian Economics that I published. And poor Bob doesn't work with computers, so he sends us his handwritten text that I had to type up, and the paper is so well written. No one writes like him anymore. The slope of the Phillips curve itself has been getting flatter ever since the 1980s and is now quite small. There's no well-defined natural rate of unemployment anymore. Right? I mean, this doesn't exist anymore. Right? And it's not personal. There is no defined natural rate of unemployment, either statistically or conceptually. In the same issue, Bob Gordon writes, the slope of the short-run inflation-unemployment relationship has flattened. Janet Yellen, the former Federal Reserve chairperson. The slope of the Phillips curve, a measure of the responsiveness of inflation decline in labor market slack, has diminished very significantly since the 60s. Bob Gordon said, was there ever a Phillips curve? In other words, the Phillips curve appears to have become quite flat. I follow this guy Politano on Twitter. He's a specialist at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. He says the same thing. Mary Daly, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. As for the Phillips curve, blah, 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 blah. It's dead. Or it's gravely ill. Okay? So, there's so many people. And I've got 100 more quotes from respected mainstream economists who say that. But it's funny enough, the Federal Reserve still, they have to believe in the Phillips curve. Powell said, it's not dead, it's just hibernating. And it's come back to life now. And Dennis Lockhart, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, he says, oh no, it'll come back. It will assert itself in a reasonable period of time. And this is what they argue now. This is what they're arguing. And hence the justification for current monetary policy. But look at this. Central bankers are not willing to discard the Phillips curve as a policy tool, even though the evidence of a downward sloping curve is meager. Without the Phillips curve, the whole complicated paraphernalia that underpins central bank policy suddenly looks very shaky. For this reason, the Phillips curve will not be abandoned lightly. And that's why, if you don't have a Phillips curve, you don't have mainstream monetary policy. And that's why Powell says, no, it still exists, it's still out there. My neighbor is an economist, trained at Oxford, PhD. We have these, argument. He goes, no. He works for a bank, and he says, no, it's out there. We just haven't quite figured out how it works, but it's there. And so this is what Powell says. We have to assume it's there. And we are operating on the basis that there is a Phillips curve. We raise interest rates, we wait, we raise interest rates, we wait, and they're just sliding along that flat curve. And eventually, so for me, this negates the possibility of a soft landing. Now, maybe inflation is coming down on its own. So maybe they will eventually say, it's coming down, okay, we're going to stop. Right? But if they continue raising rates, because now it has changed. Inflation has come down. But what the Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, and I was reading the Bank of England this morning, what they are afraid is a wage price spike. In Canada, the public servants just agreed to a 7% increase in wages. There are workers in grocery stores in Toronto, they're demanding 10%. They won't get that, but how much will they get? So now they're afraid of a wage price spiral. So that's why they're keeping interest rates high, to try to create unemployment, to give labor and unions less power in demanding. Because now, the big problem is that unemployment is very low. And restaurants and all sorts of places are arguing that they can't find workers. Do you have this here in Brazil? You can't find workers. My pub that used to...
Have that.
My pub that used to close at 2 a.m. now closes at 11 because they don't have workers. They close the kitchen at 10, whereas you could order anything until 1 a.m.
Yes, officially you have 8.5% of unemployment. And a lot of precarious work.
Yeah, in Canada and in the US, Europe, stores, restaurants, they can't find workers. And so now, the Federal Reserve is taking that as, I don't think it's that bad. I actually think that, but they're arguing, oh, you see, there's a lack of workers. Now the governor of the central bank is calling for more immigration to help the labor shortage. And this convinces them that the labor shortage means powerful labor unions, higher demand in wages.
It's funny because it's really, this dynamic is really similar to Kaletsky's article, Political Aspects of Unemployment.
Which is 80 years this year.
Yeah.
I'm publishing in the October issue an article by Malcolm Sawyer on the 80th anniversary of Kaletsky's paper on full employment. And we're going to have some sort of webinar with Sawyer presenting his paper sometime maybe early September or something like that. So I'll make you sure that you know about it.
And it's funny to think that most like wage pressures, like how they say, or elevated the wages and other things, they're more to catch up, like you said, it's more to catch up these price elevations than really to surpass this price elevation. Like here in Brazil, most things just readjust their price after inflation from the year, after they find inflation from the year, like rent and other things. So its expectations are more anchored in the past than the future.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. We had this discussion in Rio, and Lavoie was saying that he was on the bargaining union of the universities, and they were arguing in terms of past, not expectations of inflation. Because it's dangerous to base on your expectations of inflation, because if you expect inflation to be 3% and it's 5%, you've lost.
Yes.
So, anyways. Okay. No IS curve, no LM curve, no inflation target, empirical support. We're off to a rough start. Now, the concept of natural rate of interest, which is embedded in that third equation, the Taylor rule, these are just quotes. The natural rate is a key element of the new consensus model. It's a center of gravitation for short-term interest rates. Okay, what I called in a paper in honor of Marc Lavoie, I called it is the pursuit of the Holy Grail. Do you know what the Holy Grail is? Right, the cup that contained the blood of Jesus, which has never been found, right? But we assume it exists. Right? Borio, again, the natural rate is an abstract, unobservable, model-dependent concept. We can define it, we just can't measure it. Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Borio, in another paper, it's very imprecisely estimated, contains little information beyond that promised by other variables. As a result, R star is not really needed when setting the policy stance. Moreover, R star has the potential of leading us astray. Astray means, off the path. So, it's sort of it's a key variable, and a lot of, central banks will talk about the natural rate. Published estimates in Canada, the natural rate is 3.5. I should check the latest, but 3.5%, the latest I checked. So interest rates now are above the natural rate. But and that's why they're saying, oh, you see, monetary policy is working because it's coming down. So we're going to pause and we're going to start, complicated. Central bankers are like those contortionists you have in circuses. The people that can get weird position.
Yeah, but they are artists, the guys at the city. They are just protecting their power and trying to enhance their power. That's what they continue doing.
Yeah. And so that leads us back to the rules versus discretion debate. So the mainstream has sort of put aside, not abandoned, but put aside the question of rules. We no longer need a 2 or 3% increase in the money supply. Now it's all about interest rates. And we use interest rates as in the Taylor rule. If your inflation is above the target, you raise interest rates. Joan Robinson, in her book on the rate of interest, there's 2 quotes there. The regulating effect of changes in the rate of interest was at best very weak. This is 1943, people. Joan Robinson recognized that very early on. And again in 52, she called fine-tuning or counter-cyclical policies. Do you have any radio where your parents or grandparents' radio? When you want to reach a certain frequency, you go, that's fine-tuning. It's that turning of that knob until you get it just right. That's kind of monetary policy. They want to get it right, but she called that a false scent and rejects the conception of an economy which automatically held on a path of steady development by the mechanism of the rate of interest. But it is by no means easy to see how the monetary mechanism is supposed to ensure how the rate of interest actually assumes its full employment value. The automatic corrective action of the rate of interest is condemned by its very nature to be always too little and too late. 1952, 70 years ago. That's Joan Robinson, eh? And in a paper that I wrote with Mark Setterfield that started that literature on monetary policy and income distribution, because reaction functions rely on fine-tuning the economy as needed, the central bank's policy obsession with inflation often translates into repeated increases in the rate of interest until the economy finally collapses in the misguided pursuit of a soft landing. Lavoie, I'll tell you something about Lavoie. I've known Marc Lavoie for almost 40 years. And it is a blessing, but it is frustrating. Every time that I can point to you at specific ideas in that, every time I had what I thought was an original idea, right, son? Marc Lavoie has a sentence in his book about that. So in a way I'm going, oh, okay, wow. I'm smart, Lavoie agrees with what I say. Wow, okay. Or, maybe I plagiarized. Maybe I read the book so many times that these ideas are bouncing in my head and I'm just plagiarizing them. But it's very frustrating. I've had many good ideas and then you read his book and you go, damn it, it's there. Inflation control can be achieved only at the cost of large losses of economic activity. In the next presentation after the break, I've got this amazing quote by Mark. Again, I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, so I don't have much on this today. But like I said, monetary policy operates only if inflation is demand-driven. A lot on this tomorrow, so I'm not going to bother today. Central bank independence. This is crucial. You must have central banks independent in order to pursue their monetary policy for the model to work. But, you know, a lot of people, Bordeaux, these actions have seriously threatened central bank independence. Oh, yes. So this is what he was saying. 2010 is the crisis. So he's saying, you know, a lot of central banks just weren't very independent. As soon as you have a crisis, they throw that out the window. And central bank independence can be harmful if it's based on a flawed policy doctrine. In other words, he's saying, God forbid, you should never have a post-Keynesian central banker, because that would be the flawed model. Central bank independence only works if you have a conservative mainstream central banker. So in Poland in September, there's this conference in honor of Kenneth Rogoff on the conservative central banker and central bank independence. And I'm going there and this is what I'm saying. I'm going, okay, let's elect a post-Keynesian and see what your reaction is. Okay, almost done. So I wrote a paper with Guillaume Vallet, Central Bank Independence in an Age of Democratic Values. You know, you got to be able to reconcile the concept of central bank independence with democracy, with democratic value. How democratic is it to have a guy or a woman who doesn't report to anyone? You're independent. Not very, and it's so important when you are literally ruining the lives of people. And that is supposed to be, so he and I have written maybe 3 or 4 papers on this concept, and the whole book on central banking, monetary policy, and social responsibility is about that. So you have to have an institution that reflects the values. And we applied that logic to many institutions. We tell institutions, public institutions, and we tell private institutions. There's a big debate in Canada about allowing women to play on hockey teams, male hockey teams. Oh, it's the charter. You cannot. And then we tell institutions, you must hire more black people and more women. Central bank, oh, no, you don't have to do it because you're independent. And so there's a problem there. And Richard Werner from England, he's written on central bank, the relationship with democratic values about that. I'll talk about that Sekereccia quote in the next.
There's also, if I can say something,
Yeah.
there's also an amazing book by Paul Tucker that is called Unelected Power.
Oh, yeah.
It's about central banks independence.
Absolutely. And these are ideas that are, what year was that book?
It's 2018.
18, yeah. So these ideas are starting to come out. I don't think they're going to have much of an impact. I think concept of central bank. There's a guy in Canada, a politician, when the central bank started raising interest rates, he says, if I'm elected prime minister, I'll fire the guy. Oh my God, it led to accusation. How dare, it's because we're so obsessed with inflation. I'm going to say this tomorrow. There's absolutely zero empirical work that says low inflation is good. Stiglitz and other people have argued inflation is not a problem until it reaches 20-30%. It doesn't have labor market distortions of this. So why are we so obsessed? Like I said, it's to protect the wealth of rentiers. This is what I think. Okay. How are we doing for time? I've got a couple more slides. Again, the Friedman in a democracy, right? Friedman was saying, in a democracy, to have so much power concentrated in a body free from any kind of direct, effective political control is dangerous. Money, he stated, is too important to be left in the hands of central bankers. It's a great paper. It's an early paper, and he's very critical. He's making the argument for his monetary rules. Okay, you can criticize that. But I think that the criticism is valid. We should be fundamentally fearful of concentrated power, which is what the Tucker book is. For this obscure British economist, he says he's not opposed to the experts in central banks, but he says CBI must guarantee that authorities operate in the interests of society as a whole, rather than those of private or public groups.
Here in Brazil, the inflation target was just calculated for the year inflation before. Now it's for the 12 months before. So one of the arguments of this actual central bank president was, oh yes, inflation is coming down, but the year inflation is still elevated.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, this is what we call changing the goalpost.
Yes.
You have a goalpost and your job is to take the ball. I'm holding an American football in my hands, and the goal is to score here. And then you get here and you go, oh no, the goalpost is over there. Damn. And then once you get to no, it's over there. Right? You change the goalpost. And that's what we call moving the goalpost. And that's what they do. Inflation is down. Yes, but. Okay. Anyways, great quote by Keynes. And at the end of the day, two things. Do they perform any better than less independent central banks? It's puzzling, ambiguity. What's his name? Barry Aiken-Green has an index of central bank independence. I don't know. And there's been older papers as well that argue that central bank independence has no clear effects on inflation. This is probably true. As long as you carry out mainstream monetary policy, whether you're independent or not, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if you raise your interest, this argument that, I think it's the theory that's more important than the independence. And then at the end is independent from whom? This is Jurietsky. Where central banks are independent of the executive branch of government, they tend to be dependent on the financial sector for political support, political validation. Like I said yesterday, I think, when inflation was starting to go up, in March last year, central banks were saying, it's temporary, we're not going to raise rates. It's when they started to be attacked by the financial interests. But that's when they started, you're losing legitimate, and there were lots and lots of newspaper articles calling into question the legitimacy of central banks. If you don't fight inflation, if you don't raise interest rates, you're not a legitimate central bank. And so that opened, and then central banks said, oh, okay, fine, we're going to raise interest rates. I firmly believe in that story. And therefore, tend to make policy with, like I said, finance-colored glasses. And this is a quote from the Encyclopedia of Central Banking that I edited with Sergio Rossi in 2015. And you can see not only in Polanyi, but a very sort of Weblerian argument. I'm writing a paper right now with Wesley Marshall in Mexico, and we're looking at central bank independence from the view of Veblen and Polanyi. It's very interesting. Okay, finally, monetary policy dominance. I said this before. It's the idea that it's a fear of fiscal policy. Beyond that, it's a fear of the state. It's a fear of the state. It's the idea that the state, right, it's the Leviathan. It goes back to the Leviathan. The state cannot be trusted. The state, look at, as soon as the President of the United States cancels the debt of students, he canceled the debts of some students, and then the Republicans took him to court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. It's this fear of fiscal policy. Crowding out effects leads to higher interest rates, crowding out effects, inflation. So you need monetary, the perfect scenario is monetary austerity and fiscal austerity in the times of inflation. You need to curb your inflation in order not to produce more inflation, and you need your interest rates high in order to bring down your demand inflation.
It's like Fitch ratings downgraded the US debt.
And so, for the record, let's not forget that it is these rating agencies that caused the financial crisis to begin with, when they ranked all these subprime crises as being subprime loans as being AAA. And people were buying them in Europe, so that the contagion effects to Europe is European banks are saying, these are great, look, they're saying it's AAA, we're going to buy it. As soon as, you lit the spark of, then everything just went to hell in a hen's basket. I think that's the expression. Everything went to hell in a hen's basket. Okay? So, conclusion. What's left of mainstream monetary model? As Borio said, inflation has proved rather insensitive to monetary policy easing. Then what? I think he's changed his tunes a little bit since inflation. But for me, this is the paper that I wrote, The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy in Fighting Inflation. And it's in our book, The Future of Central Banking, in the series. Like I said, this is a series dedicated to central banking in terms of income distribution, social responsibility, gender, exchange rates, China, okay? There's now 7 or 8 books published, and there's the one I'm finishing now is Central Bank Monetary Policy and Financialization. There's Central Bank Monetary Policy and Shadow Banking coming, and there's Central Bank Monetary Policy and Asset Bubbles. She's doing one on China. So there's a lot of monetary policy implementation. There's probably going to be about 15 or more books coming soon. And so for us, we're looking at the empirical and the theoretical evidence of this mainstream model, and we're going, there's just nothing there. And it's worth repeating. Without the Phillips curve, or without even the IS curve and Phillips curve together, the whole complicated paraphernalia that underpins central bank policy sort of looks very shaky. And that underpins the whole notion of fine-tuning of the Taylor rule. The Taylor rule makes no sense in a theoretical and empirical void. So I've broken down everything. Conclusion is there's nothing left. So let's rebuild monetary policy. That's what we'll do after the break.
Okay. You quoted Keynes 4 times.
I'm getting better. Less and less. Any questions? Okay. We'll break. It's 1:45. Let's take 20 minutes. We'll come back at 3:05, and we'll go for another hour, and then a discussion afterward. I would really like it if you ask questions, even if they're silly questions. There are no silly questions. No stupid questions. Just ask. Even if you're not sure of what you're asking, we'll figure it out. Okay? Break. Let's be back in 20. And let's note for if someone taking notes that there's no cake today.
Would you like some?
No. I'm okay without coffee.
Say,